Good morning, everyone. We'll call the meeting to order. Just a couple of preliminaries. Committee, we have a number of bills that are likely to come before House Judiciary prior to the cutoff date, which is next Wednesday. So today we have a rather light load because of how we had to notice bills as they came available. But the remaining days, Friday, Monday, and Wednesday, anticipate an early start because we're going to have a bunch of bills queuing up, I suspect, and we'll have to do our best to accommodate that. But that also means there will be, in all likelihood, bills that just don't get heard. I think that's just a reality we have to anticipate. Also, I just want to remind everyone to make sure you use your microphones, both witnesses up front and committee members. When you're going to speak, make sure you have a green light on your microphone so that everyone out in the Zoom world, as well as everyone in the room, can hear each other. Just a reminder to everyone that we do have rules of decorum that we will follow. Those rules are available on a hard copy alongside the agenda. They're also available on the LSO website. So the goal here is simply to remind everyone to treat each other with respect as we proceed through these meetings. With that, Madam Secretary, let's call the roll.
Representative Crago.
Here.
Representative Chestick. Here. Representative Haroldson. Representative Jennings. Representative Nemec. Representative Oakley. Here. Representative Provenza. Representative Rodriguez-Williams. And Chairman Washut.
Here.
Thank you.
We have a quorum. Appreciate everybody being here this morning. These are familiar bills to us, brought to us by our task force in our last meeting and move forward for the session. So Representative Larson, you want to walk us through these bills, remind us what we're doing with these? We'll start with House Bill 27.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. And for those that are watching, House Bill 27 really is a product of the Task Force on Vulnerable Adults and Mental Health. And this recommendation really even goes back further and comes out of the Mental Health Task Force in 2017 and was brought forth again as we reviewed to see what, if any of those were not implemented, that we still think were valid and had warranted consideration. Adult Protective Service falls in the jurisdiction of Department of Family Service Director Smith's agency. And as they manage the issues that go around vulnerable adults, if the Department of Family Services receives a report that a vulnerable adult is suspected of being abused, as well as if they have been, there's a requirement that they'll notify law enforcement that, and so it just kind of sets the stage in a community of this, the DFS is reported. And so if law enforcement gets a call, they say, oh yeah, we're familiar with that. But the opposite of that is not true. If currently, if a law enforcement officer determines that a vulnerable adult is being abused, he has to notify the department, but not if there's just a report or if there's a suspicion. And so the department could walk into a situation where the law enforcement's been there maybe multiple times over the weekend and they don't know that. And so we're just trying to help in the management of these vulnerable adult situations and require good communication between law enforcement and Department of Family Services. And so we add, Mr. Chairman, to the requirements in 352103, the requirements for the Department of Family Services is in C, and in D, we amend those, the statutes that govern what the enforcement officer does. And we changed the language, say if a law enforcement officer receives a report that a vulnerable adult is being suspected of being or has been neglected, that they have to notify law enforcement. So that's the changes we make. Happy to take any
Thank you.
questions.
Director Schmidt, any comments?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Corin Schmidt. I'm the Director of the Department of Family Services, and no further comments other than here to answer any questions.
Question, Representative Oakland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Schmidt, I don't imagine, or Representative Larson, either one, I don't imagine that this causes law enforcement any great concern. Have you had any discussions or anything about that?
Director? Chairman?
So during the task force meetings, we of course included law enforcement in the conversation, and they did not raise any concerns at that time. Mr. Chairman, if I might add, there was language in there that the peace officer had to make that. And I think if you look at that, if a law enforcement officer, and so we strike the language so that it doesn't have to be the officer, just the agency has to get back. So we tried to clean that up a little bit. That was their only concern.
Further questions? I have one. When I read subsection E that follows these changes, I have a bit of a concern that it requires an investigation because it anticipates that there is a actual event, an actual circumstance needing care. So if the officer is, or the agency is reporting to DFS only perhaps an unfounded situation, right? You had a report, the officer goes, rules doesn't appear to rise to the level of needing adult protection, but has to notify you, then subsection E sounds like you have to do an investigation regardless. Is that how you read subsection E, Director?
Mr. Chairman, the investigation may be that we just look into it. It doesn't mean that we would open a full-blown investigation. So we assess whenever we get a report. So the law enforcement may report to us, then we'll screen it based on the criteria of, does this meet a higher level? We may know of the family or the person ahead of time. And so any more information that law enforcement gives us may help us then in determining what kind of services we could provide. I think it's important to note, if I may, Mr. Chairman, that the adult protective services that we offer are largely case management and prevention. The department doesn't have the authority to take an elder adult or vulnerable adult into custody. And we don't have anywhere where we could place a vulnerable adult anyway. So the majority of the services that we provide are just voluntary services, unless there's a larger reason to be concerned. For example, in the case of financial exploitation, then we would use those statutes to look into that.
Director, do these cases ever rise to a level of a Title 25 matter where you?
Mr. Chairman, yes, they can. I don't have any data that tells us how many of those cases come to our notice and then turn into a Title 25. But if we're having that, if there's that much concern about a vulnerable adult, we're going to be working with the county attorneys and law enforcement anyway, and those are the people who would make that decision.
Further questions? Thank you. Representative Oakland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just kind of a random question. What, if you know, generally, what percentage of your cases are adults or vulnerable adults? Do you know, Director?
Director, of all the DFS cases, how many fall in this category?
Mr. Chairman, about, if you'll let me do some quick math, about 1/4 or so are adult protective services cases that are reported. Then we go through the screening process, and how many do we actually then do a formal intake varies.
And one last question for me. What happens if law enforcement doesn't report. You know, we create these statutes that don't have any teeth in them, and so they're kind of anticipating that people will comply, but can you see where there might be a problem if a particular agency simply falls into a pattern of not complying with the statute?
We is going to make him walk rather than ride. You know, I think it being a little facetious when we, it's easier when you have laws that pertain to industry or the private sector that you impose a rule, and if they violate it, then there can be a penalty. The penalty back on a sister agency or local agency is a little more difficult. However, we find that generally speaking, and I think the large majority of the time, governmental entities try to comply with statutes and in their best interest anyway. And so that was not really a concern that we noted that as well, but we felt.
Is there anyone else wishing to testify with regards to House Bill 27? Anybody on Zoom? No one on Zoom? Anyone in the room? Mr. LeClaw. Good morning. Welcome. State your name for the record. Make sure your green light's on, and then tell us what you want the committee to know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. I'm Tom Laycock with AARP Wyoming. We put a number of miles on the truck this interim following around the Vulnerable Adult Mental Health Task Force. In our role, we looked at it as being sort of the voice of the consumer, sort of the eyes of the consumer, to make sure that nothing was maybe, you know, there wasn't maybe too heavy-handed of a look in any of these rules or laws that were being proposed. We're very supportive of what came out of this. We unfortunately had, as this group, it's this membership organization, we have a tendency to be sort of a phone call of desperation sometimes. And we're getting a lot of that right now in property tax. But over the course of the time that we were working with the task force, we actually had 2 cases that called us where folks said, I need help, I don't know where to go. In each case, having listened to what kind of APS actually does and the role actually is in terms of trying to find local resources for those who need it, we were able to get things kind of turned over and then actually got to see the process from the inside. So that probably made it a little bit easier for us to not just support the laws that are being proposed here, but also the work that APS is doing.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Laycock? Yeah, thank you for being here this morning. Anyone else wishing to testify? Okay, I'm going to close public comment on House Bill 27. Committee, what's your pleasure? Moved by Representative Provenza. Second by Representative Shestak. Discussion. Any suggested amendments or comments? Are we good? Representative Oka.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this really is just a comment. I don't have any amendments or anything, but I just wanted to say and just kind of really reiterate what Representative Larson said. But one of the things I liked about this was that there wasn't a compliance piece. I don't like the idea that when we're telling, you know, agencies and law enforcement, things like that, if you don't do it, you're going to go to jail. Or what this does is gives the direction that says, hey, that's what you're supposed to be doing. I think we can trust, and it gives the guidance necessary, and then law enforcement knows that it's required. So I get behind that, and like I say, I actually appreciate the lack of a stick, sort of a piece with this.
Anything further? I'd just like to say that one of the things that came out over the interim as we talked about these, for those folks who are maybe listening in, was the you know, when we're dealing with children, we have a whole foster care system of resources available. And when we're dealing with adults who are, you know, sometimes living in squalor or, you know, isolated and alone and have all sorts of challenging situations, we don't have anything comparable to that for adults. And so it is a case management period, and making sure that everybody's communicating certainly helps. Because in my career, I remember seeing some of these cases that deteriorated over time. When you got that initial report and things didn't look that bad, And then, 2 months down the road, things had deteriorated significantly. And then the value I see with this is that the department is going to know that law enforcement has been to the house however many times over the preceding months. And hopefully we can keep things from escalating, intervene early when a smaller remedy may be adequate. So I like the bill. And call the roll for the bill.
Representative Kriegel,
Aye.
Representative Chestick,
Aye.
Representative Haroldson,
Aye.
Representative Jennings, Representative Nemec,
Aye.
Representative Oakley,
Aye.
Representative Provenza, Representative Rodriguez Williams. And Chairman Washut.
Aye.
We have the total of 1 no and 8 ayes.
And with that, House Bill 27 will move to Committee of the Whole. That takes us to our next bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to come back and review with the committee House Bill 26, which is intended to increase the length of time that emergency protective services can be in effect. And to the point that Director Schmidt in our previous bill and Chairman, you noted, in adult protective services, we don't have the authority to take control of what's the term we're using? Protective custody of an adult like we do a child. And so when the mental health task force was working, in talking about adult protective services, protecting the rights, and it's a fine line to ensure that we're not imposing or impeding on the rights of this individual as an adult. If they want to live in squalor, they have a right to do that. Then there's this fine line that they, because of capacity or whatever that issue is, may not know they're living in squalor and putting themselves in. And so how do we thread that and protect their rights, and then also perhaps provide the help that they need? And so part of what we feel is a way to help in that is currently, if the court provides adult protective services, that's limited to 72 hours. And we propose amending that to be 14 days. The rationale behind that is sometimes it just takes more time to get the work done for the agencies, particularly if you have a weekend involved in there. If you've got a vulnerable adult, perhaps it's we find is in a hospital setting or alike that lacks capacity, and the caseworker needs to have time to find out who the family is, where they're at, how to get the connection between the family member to the adult, and that can easily exceed the 72 hours, and without having to go back to the courts to arrange that, having that extended to 14 days seemed to be a reasonable recommendation to adopt into statutes. And so with that, and that really is the essence of this bill. And Mr. Chairman would be happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Representative Shostak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Lloyd, Larson. As I understand it, the 14 days is not a requirement. It creates flexibility. The court has the discretion to go up to 14 days, whereas now it can only go up to 72 hours. So we're not requiring a 14-day order. It's just gives the court flexibility and perhaps reduces the number of times as we go back and get extensions. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Chesick, that's correct.
Thank you.
Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got if maybe you could tell us what protective services looks like for adults in this situation, because I think one of the things that might be of concern is thinking of it as like, involuntary custody type of thing for 14 days without. And I don't think that's what we're talking about. So if you could tell us what, give us an idea again of the different ways of handling protective services for vulnerable adults.
Director?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Oakley. These are situations that are a little bit more on the extreme. So these aren't cases that we see all the time, real frequently. These are those situations where there may be immediate harm due to self-neglect, for example, where an elderly person is in their home, they're severely ill, they may not be wanting to access any medical resources, neighbors are very concerned, law enforcement has gone, and then it's at that point that we would make a decision if we would need to get the court involved. But that's pretty extreme. As I said, most of what we do in the world of adult protective services is trying to connect vulnerable adults with local resources. What we do know is that oftentimes what's missing in these cases is a person, a guardian, a family member that's willing to step in and help that vulnerable adult make some decisions. So in between that time where we have somebody who may be severely ill but doesn't want to leave their home, and we're trying to find somebody that can come in and help them make those decisions, but they need medical care, then that might be a place where we would go to the courts and say, look, courts, would you please help us get this person to medical services so that we can get them treated? And then we can do the work that we need to do to, one, help them get in onto Medicaid. If that's an issue, we can help connect them to food sources. If that's an issue, we can get somebody in to clean a home. If that's an issue, and then most importantly, get the medical care that they would need to continue. So we would be doing that all along the way. However, in some situations, there will be a determination that a person can decide, I'm going to stay at home. And then that's where the question comes in, is this person meeting the criteria of vulnerable adult with severe self-neglect that really does require a little bit more intervention because there's nobody else around to help make those decisions. In that situation, then they could go to a hospital. And then that's what we would be doing the work that we need to do to see if we can get them connected with either a family member or at least try to get a guardianship into place. And most frequently, that's what we end up doing is trying to get a guardianship into place. We have a contract with the Guardianship Corporation that allows us to do that. So those would be kind of the array of services. There's nothing that prevents older adults or even younger adults from making bad decisions. And we respect that. And it's a real fine line for us sometimes because we understand that as adults, people have the right to make decisions that we may not agree with. So it is a fine line. And that's why we really don't go to the courts unless there's an extreme issue that says we really do need additional help. In conversations with law enforcement over the course of the last year, as this topic keeps coming up, it is a source of frustration for the system because we are between a rock and a hard place a lot of times because we do respect the autonomy of an adult and we want to do our best to keep vulnerable adults at home. I mean, that really is our priority. We recognize and understand people do so much better at home. So when we talk about emergency services or protective services, it really just gives us the confidence that maybe if this person, for example, is in the hospital, that they'll stay there, get the treatment that they need while we are in turn then trying to find all of those other resources, connect with family members so that they can go back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so some of that stuff, getting a guardianship, maybe hospital placement might be time consuming. And the way it is currently, if that 72 hours passes, you've lost your ability to help, possibly.
Representative.
Thank you,
Yep.
Mr. Chairman. So I've got a couple scenarios I'm just going to lay out just for my own brain. And then maybe a question at the end of that. So first scenario, let's say it's Friday evening, 7 o'clock. A neighbor calls law enforcement and says, hey, I'm really concerned about my neighbor. Fill in the blank. They could have a scenario. Law enforcement shows up and they're like, oh my goodness, this is dire. This person needs help. And that person says, absolutely not. I'm just fine. I mean, we've all got that neighbor that's old and crotchety and we get it, right? This says here that there has to be a court hearing to get that 72-hour window started, right? So what happens on Friday night at 7 o'clock when, I mean, obviously you're not going to get a court hearing. What's that weekend look like? That's first question. So can you explain that? Then I'm going to give you another scenario. I'll give you two and then we can talk about both of them. The second is this, we get that court hearing. Obviously it's Friday night again. We get that court hearing. It's a long weekend. We can't get it accomplished. Monday, no one's going to be in office because it's Christmas or it's 4th of July or something like that. 72-hour window is definitely not long enough. But 14 days when we already have the option for a 30-day modifier in there almost seems a little extensive. Talk to me about like a 7-day window compared to the 14-day window. So we still have 7 days, 30 days potentially. Talk to me about that.
Director?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Haroldson, to get to your first question first about court, and I think possibly Representative Oakley could speak to this as well. In any of our protective services, child or adult, we work real closely with county attorneys and law enforcement. And there are times where certainly if emergency requires it, that there can be an emergency hearing. So the vulnerable adult is not going to necessarily sit and wait for 8 o'clock on Monday when the court's open. We will be making calls, county attorneys, law enforcement. That system is there for child protection. It's also there for adult protective services. If that need is that extreme. Again, that we don't see that frequently, but when it's there, then certainly we can use it. So that's the answer to your first question. In regard to the second question about what's long enough, with the 72 hours, and if we have, that's 3 days, and if we have an extended weekend because of a holiday, that's 6 days, right? So if somebody comes in, court is issued an order on a Tuesday, we have through that next week to try to get those things done. But that's still only 3 business days. And I think that's the hiccup for us, is that weekends, when we're working with trying to find resources, a lot of those resources aren't going to be available on Saturdays and Sundays and holidays. It's community. But if we could have, a decent 5 days of business working days, that would be good. We just know that in 3 business days, there's not a lot we can get done when you're dealing with the complexity of these cases, especially when they get to the point where we're looking for emergency services. That means there's a lot happening within that person's life that's going to be a little bit more difficult to untangle. So, to your question, 14 days, that's 14 days. That includes weekends. So really, we're only looking at 10 business days with the update to the statute. 3 business days comparatively, a matter of 7 days difference. Would 2 extra be helpful? Yes. We just know 3 days is pretty limiting.
So the 30-day escalator, if I'm correct, you would have to go back to the court. So what this does is gives you a larger window, potentially, if the judge agrees the 14 days is needed, without having to go back and take up judicial time to get the extension. Is that an accurate summary of how that works?
Mr. Chairman, yes, it is. Just going to hold it right here.
Mr. Chairman, I would just note, I've seen her do that on my chest a few times too.
So yes, Mr. Chairman, that's a reasonable way of looking at it. This isn't to say, yes, you have to have this much time. This is up to. And certainly we do not want to extend if we don't have to. So the 14 days gives us a little bit more time 3 days probably will not. So we'll end up going to the court and then you're extending it for another 30 days potentially. So this, I think, does a good job of kind of splitting the difference.
And so if a judge were to give you a 14-day period and you get everything done in 5 days, do you have to go back to the court and ask them to cancel that? Or do you just wait out the 14 days and not do anything?
Mr. Chairman, what I would hope we would do is close the case. And then there's no court order necessary anymore.
Further questions? One more. Representative Oakland?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to finalize this discussion, in case an amendment is coming, what is your preference on the time frame here?
Director?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Oakley, I think our preference would be 5 business days plus weekends. So that gives us a total of 9. So if there's an adult that's staying in the hospital, it gives us, they have that care that they may need for up to a week. It gives us 5 business days to then get everything in place.
Prefer 9 over 14.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, we would be fine with that.
Representative Craigle?
Just to follow up, Director. So are you opposed to the 14? You think that's too long? I think we're just trying to get exactly, I mean, I understand you're willing to go less, but simpler is better in my mind. I mean, when you start 14 flat days, doesn't talk about weekends, doesn't talk about holidays. When you start doing 5 business days plus holidays, and then some counties have different holidays than other counties. I mean, I'm just curious if there's a way to keep it very simple, and if there's a reason to take it down from 14, I'm willing to do it. But if there's not, I just say we stick with what the task force decided.
Representative?
That really was the discussion we had at the task force. We started putting together different scenarios and just thought it was easier to say 14 days rather than 5 business days, not excluded weekends, but then there's holidays, and on the leap year, you add in something there. And that's really where we come up to the 14 days. And Mr. Chairman, I think for the committee, I think that the chairman's question and Director Smith's point, I think is really important. That is really important. Is that once you're done, it doesn't mean you don't carry the case to the full 14 days. When it's done, you close the case and you're done with that court order.
Anything further? All right. Is there anyone in the room wishing to testify on House Bill 26? Welcome back.
Tom Laycock, still representing what Representative Harold termed as the old and crotchety. Mr. Chairman, we like this bill because what we heard in over the summer was that there are a number of times where that extension is needed. And rather than have an APS employee working on something court related, I want them finding home delivered meals. I want them finding a way to, maybe get the place cleaned up, things along those lines. I don't want to pull them off of that duty. I want them finding family members. So for that reason, we appreciate what the bill says and what it's trying to do.
Questions? None? Thank you. Anyone else in the room wishing to testify on House Bill 26? Seeing none, anyone on Zoom? No one waiting in Zoom world? I'll close public comment. Committee, what's your preference? Moved by Harrelson, second by Provenza. Discussion, Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I would propose on line 8, striking 14 days and inserting 9 days. So it'd simply read, line 7, starting for a period not to exceed 9 days. The order may be extended up to an additional 30-day period. That just gives them the 5-day window. Obviously, the balance we're fighting here is we don't want to take people's rights, but there are opportunities and moments where we do need to help people. So I think that we need to always try find that balance. And I agree, 72 hours puts them square in a problem. But I think if we did 9 days, that does give them, in the worst case scenario, 5 business days. in probably a normal scenario, maybe even 6 business days potentially. And I think that would be a good balance where we could find the middle ground and fix a problem, but at the same time not go too far. And if they need longer, we give them that 30-day window. So that'd be my amendment.
There a second to the amendment? Second by Jennings. Discussion on the amendment. Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I just want to say, I mean, hopefully we're not taking people's rights away for any reason. So I just think, you know, we're just trying to allow time and flexibility for the department to help. Again, they're not like in custody during this time or something. So I kind of tended to lean towards the discussion that we had. The task force looked at this, did discussion. And I just tend to think I'm for keeping it as presented.
Further discussion? Seeing none, sensing a desire to vote. No further amendments. So on this amendment, all in favor of Representative Harrelson's amendment to change 14 to 9, say aye. Those opposed?
Oh.
That amendment has failed. Further amendments? Further discussion? Question called on the bill? Call the roll.
Representative Cragel, Representative Chestick. Aye. Representative Harrelson. Representative Jennings. Representative Nemec,
Aye.
Representative Oakley,
Aye.
Representative Provenza. Representative Rodriguez Williams.
Aye.
And Chairman Washut.
Aye.
We have a total of 8 ayes and 1 no. Thank you.
Before you leave, do you wish to manage these bills on the floor? I'd be happy if you would take the lead on the bills. Thank you. And with that, that concludes our business for today. And thank everyone for your work, and we'll be back at it early Friday morning. Thank you.